Episode 39, Varmints, Eating the Wild. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how the later rounds of 17th century colonists took a few notes from their previous unsuccessful predecessors and decided maybe hanging on to all the notions of what it meant to be civilized wasn't worth their life. So some of the early food prohibitions around eating wild critters were dropped in exchange for a full belly now and then. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that while most of these earliest colonists were city people, large numbers of later arrivals were displaced country people. In the 17th century, the countryside in England was pretty well tamed. Bears were all gone by about the year 1000 CE, and the last wolves were done in that century. So we're very thin on the ground for all the English colonists, rural or not. They were coming from a world where wild meant rats and hedgerow critters, and other than birds and a few fish, eating wild critters was not really part of their menu. Sure, rabbits were on the table, biblical prohibitions notwithstanding, and were an object of poaching or not poaching questions. And as I've outlined, deer were on the fashionable table. But rats, hedgehogs, badgers, foxes, bats, frogs, weasels, squirrels, snails, and bugs were not eaten by anyone who was making notes about dinner. By the 17th century, Northern Europe and Britain especially had developed narrow and very certain ideas about what was and was not food. And it was pretty restrictive, especially when matched up against the menus of Roman Britain in the first 4 centuries of the Common Era, and the expanding and exploratory menus of the Norman French, and the competitive collection of people who would one day become Italy. But by the Elizabethan age, England was willing to import spices like crazy, but other elements of culinary exchange stopped hard at the Channel. Part of it was certainly that the range of fruits and vegetables that grew in the cooling climate of the 17th century was limiting, but the fact that even the range of meat sources was being narrowed, England was definitely starting towards its "we eat beef or nothing" phase, seems odd. And even fish intake was reducing. I mean, the English were living on an island. Part of it was Henry VIII's ending of the Catholic religious house organization. Things like fish ponds disappeared. Henry's own preference for game and birds also pushed fish more towards a poverty food, as did the tendency of many Protestant sects to specifically not eat fish because its consumption on Catholic fast days was seen as popish idolatry, along with recognizing saints' days or even celebrating Christmas. And the ongoing overfishing and polluting of England's major waterways simply made fish a continuously more difficult food to get. So for these and many other reasons, fish eating actually fell among the English in the 17th century. And it wasn't as if there weren't other potential meat options arriving on their shores. The English were importing guinea pigs, generally known as cavi and cuy back home in the Andes, but only as pets. Almost as soon as the Spanish brought a few of the cute little buggers back on a boat, they started showing up in rich people paintings. Queen Elizabeth I had one as a pet, and the way they show up in portraits of rich kids all the way through the 19th century, they were definitely purse dogs before there were purse dogs, and they were never considered as dinner. All during the late Middle Ages, England was domesticating itself and was also seriously domesticating its meat selection. Sure, lots of our modern English names for meat are laundered versions of the French words for the same animal: sheep versus mutton, ox or cow versus beef, calf versus veal, pig or swine versus pork. But by the 17th century, English cookery and continental cookery were peeling away from each other. As a result, what the colonists brought in their heads when they thought of food was a pretty small selection as compared to what was actually out there. The most immediate result was almost all of them died. Partly it was ignorance, not knowing where to look, and especially with plants, not knowing how to prepare them. But also, they were working from a strong sense of what was civilized and what was savage. So much so that many were willing to die rather than seek out new foods and new ways of getting food. Thus, multiple colonies were simply done in. But the surviving kids of these disastrous ventures, and those growing up with the stories of people dying of starvation, had different thoughts. While the civilized English people were dying in their numbers, the local people, the American tribes, kept showing up looking like Greek statues. They had glossy hair, ran fast, and could be wondrously or terrifyingly strong. And their children, while confoundingly naked, appeared to be happy and healthy. As a result, many an English person born on this foreign shore and looking to establish their own little cabin in the woods began to be rather suspicious of all the dicta that civilized people only ate a short list of foods or they would be lost to savagery. Compared to starvation, the savagery of strange cooked critters, or as they would come to be called, varmints, started to look awfully tempting, even perhaps delicious. Few of the people who were writing down recipes tended to cook or eat varmints, or at least if they did, rarely was it recorded. But people writing journals and letters did record eating new animals in the New World. In plenty of sources, it was pretty much the Instagram equivalent of, "Look what I saw someone eating," or "Look what I ate on this crazy trip I took with the savages. Here's me posing with them. They gave me a necklace." But quite a few of the journals are sincere and have accounts of how a family, even without a herd of goats, pigs, and cows, might eat meat, or how a trapper or other adventurer might keep their belly full when the pocket pies ran out. So let's talk varmints, what people were eating and how, and based on their recollections, maybe do a little ranking of yummy to no thanks, one taste was enough. One of the earliest varmints that the explorers wrote home about was the porpentine, or as we know it now, the porcupine. Most of the incredulousness came from wondering how in the world the native tribes even caught one, what with all those spines. Once cooked whole, these herbivores turned out to be tender and quite savory. Clearly, the local tribes had lots of practice handling porcupines, since there is a huge amount of decorative art on apparel and in other places using porcupine quills. But as Englishmen encountering what appeared to be a wandering and occasionally attacking spiny bush, they were in awe of the ability to handle it. And when they found the meat was tasty, approval increased. However, since the colonists could barely catch a fish, figuring out how to handle a whole entire porcupine was ever going to be beyond them. Now consider the polecat, the stink badger, or as we commonly know it now, the skunk. Incidentally, the skunk's scientific name is Mephistus mephistus, which translates basically to stinky stinky. Even in the 17th century, people were writing back home about this adorable to beautiful animal, how it was smartly adorned in black and white stripes, and how it should be named Jupiter's dog for its fine, proud tail. However, its smell, when it was killed or threatened, was, quote, the smell of the most vile sin. These little omnivores were included occasionally in the native diet, and the presence of their striking skins was noted by colonial diarists, and not just for their attractive stripes. Skunk skins retain the fantastically stinky sulfur thiols as well. Oh, and FYI, sulfur thiols can be neutralized by a solution of hydrogen peroxide, baking soda, and a bit of dish detergent. Actual chemists have looked into this, probably while wearing ventilators. It turns out that the tomato juice thing just blocks the smell. It doesn't remove it. Anyway, while skunks might occasionally be eaten, the colonists were not going to mess with the little guys if they could at all help it. Semi-aquatic rodents, on the other hand, beavers and muskrat, were both considered edible, and the fattiness of the beaver's tail actually made it desirable. This worked out fairly well for everyone except the beavers. Beaver pelts and their scent glands were in demand in England and Europe, since they had been hunted to extinction or scarcity in most places and actually were one of the early money-making ventures of the New World. Having come across antique beaver pelts, I can attest that their fur is extremely soft and thick, and can understand why in the days of rough woolens and linens and unheated spaces, beaver pelts would be desirable. And their dense fur was excellent for making the felt used in hats, including those tall black hats we still associate with pilgrims in American Thanksgiving pageants. The waxy substance castoreum from beaver scent glands by their tails was used medicinally and in perfumes at this time. And it will return as a food additive in the 20th century. Yes, we will be talking about beaver but enhanced artificial raspberry flavoring. So hang on to that. Both of these animals were common sights and reasonable quarry for the colonists since humans, muskrats, and beavers all frequented streamsides for their own reasons. As an aside, beavers were often included in the medieval menagerie of fantastical animals in heraldry that were part of this and part of that. After all, if you could see for yourself something that was clearly part rodent and part fish, whiskers and teeth up front, but webbing on the feet, and a scaly fishy tail on the back, not to mention bats that were obviously half mouse and half bird, why not believe in unicorns, manticores, sphinxes, and griffins? I mean, if you've ever looked upon the fanged, bewhiskered face of a bull sea lion and heard its grumbly roar and seen it porpoising in the sea, you tell me it's not a hybrid of a lumbering bear and a mighty fish. Just for fun, I'll have a short movie I took of some sea lions I saw this summer in the Salish Sea off the coast of Washington State, posted in my show notes. Also falling into the tasty category were raccoons. The fact that they had generally decorative and warm fur, but without the skunky stink, made them popular. Like skunks, raccoons are opportunist omnivores, so as long as they're eating crayfish, frogs, and plenty of mushrooms and wild plants, it seems that they were generally fat and tasty. A few hundred years later, Mark Twain would complain during his European travels that he missed the savor of raccoon. An attempted modern recreation of Twain's favorite food found that raccoons generally are what they eat, as the modern ones tasted of the modern garbage they were eating. Possums, North America's only marsupial, also tended to be a favorite food, in part because even though they have some pretty formidable-looking teeth and claws, possums are not particularly aggressive and definitely cannot run very fast. More of a concerted waddle. As a side note, they are pretty good little guys to have around in your yards and woods since they eat lots and lots and lots of bugs. They can't get or spread Lyme disease, but eat up a whole bunch of ticks. Not the prettiest of critters, but unlike raccoons and squirrels, they are not destructive. Speaking of squirrels, these two fell under the umbrella of acceptable and trappable food. They were quite a bit of work for a few morsels of meat, but they were plentiful, and squirrel skins were not to be sniffed at. Medieval fancy people loved to highlight the Scandinavian red squirrel pelts in their mittens and cloaks, listing them in their wills and letters when they sent them as gifts. And the slippers Cinderella wore in her incarnations before there was any European glass were vair, or V-A-I-R, which is French for squirrel fur. This explains everything because vair, V-E-R-R-E, is French for glass. So as with rabbits, squirrels were familiar to the English, and in the absence of civilized farmed meat, would have been a sensible dinner target, an edge case of acceptable wild foods, if you will. Despite the fact that the squirrel is a rodent and was acceptable food, rats and mice, on the other hand, were a no-no. Eaten in the face of famine back home, they would also become a starvation food in the New World as well. For example, listed alongside the dogs and horses those early Jamestown gold-seeking party boys were reduced to eating. But here's the thing. Before the European sailors started tramping about on these Atlantic shores, the typical invasive, tenacious, ubiquitous black and brown rats did not live here. Just as with malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, and contagious hepatitis, Europeans brought their own rats with them. Yes, North America did and still does have its own rats and mice, but unlike the European commensals, they were in no way as tied to humans, nor as aggressive and prolific as the grain, bird's nest, and vegetation destroyers that are the old world Norwegian black rat and Rattus rattus, the brown or wharf rat, which, as we all know, in modern times has staked out all the New York City pizza leavings as its very own. Woodchucks or groundhogs. Yes, we have a cranky, fat groundhog that somehow has gotten its own day, supposedly predicting how long winter misery will continue, and is the titular character of one of Bill Murray's better movies. This mid-sized rodent and close cousin to the marmots of the high rocky slopes were unexceptional but common prey for the colonial frontier dweller and American native alike. Adults range between 5 and 13 pounds, or about 2 to 6 kilos, so they made a pretty good stew, but their fur is nothing special. As mainly herbivores that opportunistically feed on insects, their meat was generally regarded as also fine, or at least generally unobjectionable. Even as their willingness to eat a greater variety of New World wild animals expanded, there was a section of the furry land animal world that the 17th century colonist was hesitant to eat. Vegetarian animals were fine, omnivores were acceptable as well, but predatory and carrion-consuming varmints and beasties were largely beyond the pale. While Native Americans would on occasion kill and eat wildcats, colonists rarely did, partly because they had no interest in doing so, but mainly because they had almost no means of killing one. Not until the late 18th century and the rise of the American rifle would cougars regularly become prey of the colonist. When a diarist would write of trying wildcat, reports would be of strange or foul-tasting stringy meat. Sightings of these cats were often at night and punctuated by fright. So then, as now, the mysterious American big wild cat goes by a wide variety of names and descriptions, including panther, painter, mountain lion, catamount, puma, ghost cat, and mountain screamer. But these 17th century animals were all cougars. Until colonists broke west, they would never see the bobcats and lynx of the north and high slopes, nor the jaguars ranging up from Central America into Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico, and Colorado. As with cats, wild, feral, and domestic being off the menu, so were the canids, wolves and foxes, while trapped for fur and, as more guns arrived on the scene, shot to protect livestock. These were not seen as eatable. As I mentioned earlier, Europeans had internal taboos about eating carnivores generally and canids particularly. When a letter writer was around cooked wolf, fox, or dog, comments typically ranged from how unpleasant the meat was to an absolute refusal to partake. The other category of carnivores that were present but largely uneaten by the colonists were weasels, martens, fishers, mink, and ermine. As mustelids, they are in the same animal family as skunks, which means they have a musky tasting meat. So as food, even among the more adventurous third and fourth generation colonial diners, were considered neither civilized nor tasty. However, they, along with their more vicious relative, the wolverine, were considered prize animals for fur. For context, winter ermine are all white with a black tail tip, which were the essential fur border in all the European royal portraits. I'll include a few in the show notes. The hardest to catch of the weasel family were the otters. Like beaver, otter fur is extremely dense and soft. It's not waterproof, but due to it being so thick, it was highly water repellent, so it was very prized for boot linings, slippers, mittens, and hats. Eating otter, on the other hand, was largely not approved. While they weren't stinky in quite the way land weasels were, just as with cormorants, they had a fish-only diet, which gave their flesh an oily, fishy taste that tended to put the colonists off. So weasels were on the menu only when all other options were unavailable. It was only a very hungry colonist who would consider eating a weasel, even if they could catch one. Now, not exactly varmints, but birds like the furry critters tended to be divided into acceptable and not acceptable. Looking through English royal and noble cookery notes shows that for the most part, if it flew, it was fit for the table, as long as it wasn't a predatory bird. Tiny birds and slightly less tiny birds, like those 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in the pie, were common fare, all the way up through herons and geese. Ducks were probably a favorite due to their reasonably handy size and their definite layer of fat. And geese are fierce. But colonists showed no interest in the New World or the Old for eating raptors. Much of this was due to hawks and eagles and falcons simply being out of reach, but as with furry critters, eating carnivores seemed to be largely out of bounds. The lack of buzzards and vultures on the menu also points to carrion eaters being extremely unappealing as well. So at last we come to the last creature that is definitely too large to be considered a varmint, but was also a new wild meat to the colonists. Bear. 17th century Europe still had bears, but the last ones had been hunted off the British Isles around the year 1000. But bear hunts with bows and spears were still something done by the nobility of Europe in the foothills of all of the mountains. The Alps, the Pyrenees, the Caucasus, the Apennines, the Carpathians, and the wilds of Scandinavia. The valor associated with the bear hunt has even lived on into modern times. All those tall, fuzzy hats worn by different ceremonial guard units the world over are bearskin. You'll know what I mean if you look at the pictures I'll put up in the show notes. Though the uniform designs are based on late 18th and 19th century styles. As you can see, there's a definite lack of knee breeches, and in the 17th century, even the ceremonial caps were more sensible. And the industrial scale needed for wholesale military uniform fur wasn't really possible with 17th century firearms and the fur processing tech of the time. So even in domesticated England, bears were known to just about all in the 17th century due to their presence in heraldry, fairy tales, and allegories. But the city dweller and the ejected country peasant alike were probably frozen at the sight of real, actual bears roaming the woods of the New World. The bears they were encountering were nearly all black bears, which then, as now, have the largest range in the future United States of America. Brown bears, or grizzly bears, live mostly north in North America and almost all west of the mountains of the Continental Divide. The first well-known American grizzly encounter seems to have waited until the Lewis and Clark expedition. But black bears live in the denser woods, and like just about all bears, are omnivores. Black bears mostly eat vegetation, digging up tubers, stripping the inner bark from trees, eating new shoots of grasses and bushes, along with the expected berries and honey. They also consume huge amounts of bugs. The bees and bee larvae that come with the honey are welcome protein, as are beetles, ants, and a large range of grubs and other worms. In season, bears love nuts, pine nuts, acorns, chestnuts, hazelnuts, even raiding the nut caches accumulated by squirrels, which should give you a sense of just how strong bear jaws are to crack open all those nuts with just their teeth. And like the rest of the bears, black bears are excellent fishers. They made many a meal of the Atlantic salmon and the other anadromous fish that filled the rivers of the East Coast before the colonists systematically emptied them out. Less known then, or at least unacknowledged, was the bear's consumption of carrion. But overall, this rich and varied diet meant that bears were generally mellow and fat, especially as they prepared for their annual period of hibernation. But as firearms improved over the 17th century, especially with the arrival of the flintlock over the matchlock, bear started to appear on the menu. Bear grease was valuable, especially the hard white fat that protected the bear's kidneys and other organs. It often stood in for the beef tallow that was highly valued in food preservation. Thus, haunches of salted and smoked bear meat would appear in cabins that lived on the edge of colonial civilization, and dinner might contain a hunk of bear bacon. Bear meat was always considered wild, but in a way that gave it the stamp of the brave. And because bears carried the most fat of just about any wild creature, that made them valuable as a meat source alongside the warm fur. Few early printed American cookbooks contain recipes for these wild creatures, and certainly none of the 17th or even 18th century books. For cookbooks then were marks of civilization and of the retention of English ways gently adapted to the New World. Game meat meant deer, turkey, partridge, pigeon, goose, and duck, and maybe some other birds. Squirrel and rabbit made occasional appearances, but the eating of the varmints was involved in plain, everyday, by eye and rule of thumb vernacular cooking, not the stuff of the printed word. Anyone using actual money to purchase a cookbook was looking for gentility, not the general instructions for stewing possum or roasting groundhog. And that pretty much wraps up the varmint eating section of the 17th century. In the 18th and 19th century, as frontier living becomes the way for the country to expand, and the rise of paper and the printing press in America made the frontier adventure story part of the intellectual landscape, more recipes for and descriptions of eating wild critters beyond the genteel deer, duck, pigeon, and partridge will enter the written record. But in the 17th century, it hovers between strange and necessary. Varmint eating will never entirely lose its fringy feel. At times, it will be considered brave, independent, and admirable. Wild critters will occasionally make their way onto the fanciest of tables as novelty, such as celebrating the exploits of Teddy Roosevelt, but it will always be seen as something one eats for just a bit, and then returns to the domesticated meat of civilization, or that small selection of game that was sporting. One thing you may have noticed about all the food I've talked about is that it all seems to take hours, or time over the course of days to prepare. And it did. You've got that right. So what did a 17th century person do for a snack? Or did they have to start thinking about what they wanted to eat 2 to 5 hours in advance? Was there such a thing as 17th century fast food? There was. More in Europe than there was in America, mostly because of infrastructure, but we'll go into all of that and what it was next week. Thanks for listening. Now, after fast food, I only have one more topic, and then it's the end of season 1. There's still time to drop me any questions on regular episodes or bonus episodes for the first question show. And then after that, I will need to go into research hibernation for a bit. So email, Twitter, or even the Facebook page is a good place to drop those questions, because I haven't figured out really how to do Instagram well, and frankly, I'm afraid of how much of my day would get eaten entirely up if I ever opened TikTok. So I'll stick to what I've got for now. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and a link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.